All right, well, we're a couple minutes in. We've got 38 out of 56. That's a passing grade. So again, my name is Glenn Keeler. I'm from the King's University, and I'm Vice President of the CUSC Board. Welcome to our annual webinar that presents the results of the most recent survey. A couple of housekeeping kinds of things. We do want, if possible, for everyone to put themselves on mute. You can turn off your audio if you don't want the world to see you. Only Nicholas and I have to be seen by everybody. The other thing is we're going to take questions, but we're going to do that at the end, and we're hoping to use the chat feature in Zoom. So for those of you, I think everybody is on the web that I'm seeing in here. Oh, there might be a couple phone people. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen, you get a menu that shows up, and one of the items on that menu is chat, and you are welcome to put questions in that, and Nicholas will address those towards the end of his formal presentation. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas now. Thank you very much. Nicholas has way longer experience with CUSC than I do, and so he's going to give us his review of interesting things out of this year's survey of first-year students. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Glenn, for that. So yeah, this is the presentation on the 2019 first-year student survey. So this is the second time that this survey has been conducted. The first-year survey has always been going on every 3 years, and in 2015, let's see if my presentation wants to go down. The CUSC board has sort of revamped, and so this is the second time that this survey has been conducted in its form. So it's actually the 25th time that CUSC has conducted this survey. In 2019, there were 46 universities from across Canada who participated in this study, yielding over 18,000 responses from first-year students. And so the response rate this year was 34%, which is actually up considerably from 26% in 2016. That's quite a big jump, and that's actually probably one of the highest we've seen since the survey has moved completely online, which is about 10-ish years ago now. A lot of that has to do with the fact that different universities participate every year, and so that jump may simply just be the fact that there were universities who participated in 2019 that had a higher response rate. I think a lot of it also has to do too, over the years we've done a lot of testing with language and information that goes into the emails to students, and so we think there's been a lot of learning that's gone on there, and I think it's another reason why that response rate has gone up. And all the results we see here are weighted back to the student population. So regardless of how many people participate from each institution, we weight it back to the student population for the first-year students at each university. We'll jump here into the profile of students. So what do our students look like? So the personal profile. So less than 1% have children, 44% self-identify as a member of a visible minority. So that includes all students who self-identify other than students who identify as Indigenous. 85% are Canadian citizens. Slightly about 2/3 are female to male ratio, which is about what we see in incoming first-year classes. It slightly, I think, underrepresents males by a few percentage points based on the sample files we receive, but generally speaking, it's fairly representative of that incoming student population. The average age of students is just over 18 years of age, which explains why less than 1% have children. 4% of students self-identify as a member as Indigenous, and 11% are first-generation students. And so first-generation students, for those unfamiliar with the term, are students who neither of their parents or guardians had taken any post-secondary education. So in theory, they are first generation to post-secondary education. Some things we see differences here in some of this personal profile information. The older a student is, the more likely they are to have children, the more likely they are to be married, and the less likely they are to be a Canadian citizen and more likely to be a permanent resident. Overall, 24% of those who've taken the survey identify as having some accessibility issue. More often than not, that is a mental health issue. So 14% overall self-identify as having a mental health issue. Now, when you actually ask people how often those accessibility issues impact them, about 5% overall say their issue impacts them on a daily basis. So it is something that they're living with on a daily basis. And again, the most common issue is a mental health issue. Some of the other common issues that students identify with is vision, is common, ADD, and learning disabilities. In terms of living arrangements, most people sort of split between those who are still living with their family and those who are living on campus. Those students who are going to smaller institutions, so results are analyzed by grouping universities into three groups, which in the report we call Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. Group 1 universities tend to be those that are simply just undergraduate institutions. Group 2 tend to be medium-sized institutions that may offer some graduate programs. And then our Group 3 tend to be the largest institutions which have graduate programs, law schools, and medical schools. And so what we find, students at smaller institutions are more likely to be living on campus than those going to those larger institutions. We also find differences here where people live. Those students who self-identify as a visible minority are less likely to be living on campus than those who do not self-identify. So we asked those who are not living on campus, would you like to be living on campus? And overall, we find that 34% of those who are not living on campus would do so if given the opportunity. So if they had the chance to live on campus, they would like to do so. So it's about 1 in 3 students who aren't living would like to be living. The interesting part I always think is if you ask them at the beginning of the year and the end of the year if that would change at all, because this survey tends to happen around sort of midpoint in the year. It'd be interesting to see sort of what happens as they start and leave their first year. Now take a look at their academic profile. So how are our first year students doing? Well, 95% are going full-time, or at least are registered full-time at the start of the term. About 3% have transferred from another institution, and 30% report having a grade of A- or higher. We do see some differences amongst these by age. Students who are older are more likely to have started their post-secondary studies earlier and have transferred from another institution, which makes sense given the fact that they are older and have had that opportunity to do so. All right, so now we start to get into some of the questions about students' feelings. And the first thing we look at is what is students' motivations for attending university? Why did they decide to attend university? And so we start off by asking people, how important were these factors in your decision to attend university? And so these are the top motivators for attending university. So you can see at the top 3 aspects are all job related, right? More likely to get a job, get a fulfilling job, or prepare for a specific job. At the bottom and not shown in these slide are factors like giving the chance to participate in varsity athletics or not having anything better to do. Those are about 10% identify that as an important reason. We also looked at what is the most important reason. So this is just students rated as important. Then we said, well, choose what is the most important reason for attending university. And you can see those job factors are most important, but the one that tends to jump out is preparing for a specific job. So that is the most important reason. They're preparing for something specific. And again, jobs still make up those first 3 aspects. And then the fourth one that kind of jumps up in there is making a positive difference. So first and foremost, work, job outcomes, most important, followed by making a difference. We do see some difference here by whether or not students self-identify as a member of a visible minority. Not shown on this slide is a factor called families' expectations, and those who self-identify as a member of a visible minority are more likely to say that meeting their family's expectations are a more important motivator for attending university than those students who are non-visible minority members. So now that they've decided and what's motivated them to go to university, well, why are they choosing the institution that they did? So we find that about 3/4 of students are applying to other universities. So it's only about 1/4 who are just setting their sight on one institution, but also there are about 13% who also decided to apply to a college or cégep. On average, a typical student applies to about 2.2 universities. So what I'll call probably their primary and their backups, about 2 institutions or 2 universities they're applying for. Students in sort of medium-sized universities were more likely to apply to multiple universities than those attending the smallest institutions and the largest institutions. So factors probably going into there is the smallest institutions often tend to be in locations that often have one university. So students are applying for there because it's where they live and is the only institution they would want to go to. And large institutions potentially because students want to go and they don't, they're putting all their eggs into one proverbial basket, if you will. So in spite of this, in spite of the fact that students are applying to multiple locations, 81% say they're attending their first choice. And again, this would be something interesting to see when they actually applied what their first choice was, or if there's a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy that goes into this when you ask them about 3/4 of the way through their first year, and if they're attending their first choice. What we do find also as students get older, they are less likely to apply to other universities. And so about 76% of those who are 18 or younger say they apply to more than one university, and that drops down to just 41% of those 22 and older. And so the older those first-year students are, the less likely they are to be applying to multiple institutions. So now we look at what is the top motivators for selecting their university. And so we can see first and foremost, the most important reason is it having the program they wanted, which makes sense given the fact that the motivator for attending university was for a job, and so they want the program that's going to get them that job. When we ask them what is the most important reason that jumps up still is having the program they wanted, but you can see towards the bottom there, amongst these top motivators, that what tends to fall second and third is having a co-op or a work experience program, but also the fact that it is close to home. At the low end, factors that have very little impact on motivators are where their friends are going, and participating in varsity athletics are at the low end of these in choosing their university. We do find a number of differences here, again, by students who self-identify as a visible minority. They are more drawn to universities that have a work experience program, but also the availability of public transportation, which likely makes sense because they're less likely to be living on campus, and so they need that public transportation to get them to and from where they're living. So this question was just asked of international students in terms of what were their motivators for attending university. You can see at the top end, they're looking for universities with a welcoming environment, the reputation, and the cost. And at the low end, what their friends or family recommend and how easy it is to obtain a visa into Canada were less factors to motivate international students. In terms of the most important sources of information, so what sources of information did students use to make their decisions? First and foremost, it really, sort of 4 factors kind of differentiate themselves. First and foremost is the university's website is rated as the high end of importance, followed by open houses, and then you have parents and other students who are attending. At the low end, and not shown on the screen, factors like the Globe and Mail University Report, the university's Facebook site, and then contact with athletic coaches are at the low end in terms of important information. We also see, again, differences here by students who self-identify as visible minority. They tend to rank a few what we call ranking factors as more important. So they tend to be more likely to use the Times Higher Education World University Rankings, the QS World University Rankings, and the Academic Ranking of World Universities more so. A lot of that may have to do with the fact that there's going to be higher rates of international students amongst those who are visible minority. So using those Times Higher Education QS World Rankings and Academic Ranking of World Universities may be of more importance. Okay, so now students have got here. So they've decided where they want to go. They've been motivated to come, and so now they're stepping in the door and they're coming to orientation. And so about 2/3-ish of students, first-year students, attended their institution's orientation. Amongst those who attended orientation, we asked them factors around satisfaction. First and foremost, they're happiest with being satisfied that orientation makes them feel welcome, providing information about student services or campus life. And then at the lower end, helping them transition and building confidence are a little bit lower, but again, around 80%, so nothing terrible here, but again, at the high end, making them feel welcome is what orientation seems to do the best. In terms of getting registered for their courses, 85% are satisfied with getting into all the courses they wanted, and 80% are satisfied with the registration process. So there seem to be A lot of issues there. Around their expectations and experiences. So we asked students, did your experiences to date, have they exceeded, met, or fell short of your expectations? You can see more students say that their experiences have exceeded than fell short of their expectations, but the majority, 2/3, say that they've met their expectations. There is a high correlation between this question and students' grade. The higher their reported grade, the more likely they are to say that their experiences have exceeded their expectations. So those with an A- or higher, 27% say their experiences have exceeded their expectation. Compared to those with a C+ or lower, just 12% say their experiences have exceeded their expectations. So a lot of it just isn't necessarily about their experiences on campus, but also about their academic experiences and how well they're likely doing as well factor into this question. So in terms of their transition to university, so where do students find success transitioning to university? And generally speaking, they find success in a number of areas. Finding their way around campus, hopefully. They're not walking into walls or going somewhere they shouldn't be going. There should be a question here about success attending class on time, but either way they can find their way around campus. Whether or not they get to class is a different question. They also find success understanding course material and finding information about academic integrity. At the low end, they find slightly less success commuting and feeling like they belong, although those are still over 80%, so still somewhat in the positive direction. In terms of where they find least success, you can see at the bottom, finding or being involved in campus activities, students find the least success. Only half say that they have found some or very much success, and also finding career information. In terms of these factors around success, there are a number of differences between students and their grades. And what we find is the higher the grades, the more likely they are to say that they're finding success in a number of areas related to their academics. So meeting academic demands, performing well in courses that require math, understanding course material, and managing their time. And so those with higher grades all report more success in those areas, which makes sense given the fact they're likely using their grades as the proxy for how much success they're having in that area. Now we look at their educational experiences and perceptions of professors. Always one of the higher rated aspects of the CUSC surveys is students' interactions with professors. So this shows you how much students agree or strongly agree with aspects around professors. And you can see at the top end, students agree or strongly agree that professors treat students the same regardless of their gender or race. And at the lower end, they're slightly less likely to agree that they're consistent, they're grading, they communicate well. So one of the questions that was added to the 2019 survey was, this question was asked in terms of, well, what are the most important factors for professors? And so we asked students to pick their top 3 most important. And you can see that in terms of what is most important is the one where professors are rated the lowest in terms of communicating well. The other aspects where students place importance are being knowledgeable in their field, being well organized, and being fair in their grading. So for the most part, these are all aspects of the in-class experience. You can see just below that as being accessible outside of class, but for the most part, the in-class experience seems to be, or at least the academic component, could be an online course, is what students tend to place the most importance in. So we asked students if they've had the ability to evaluate the teaching in their courses. 57% say they've been able to evaluate the teaching in all of their courses, and just 4% say they have not been able to evaluate the teaching in any of their courses. We find a difference here among students and their grades. 67% of those with an A- or higher say they've been able to evaluate teaching in all their courses, and that drops down to 46% of students with a C+ or lower. One of the things we've talked about is the fact that that may be a difference for those, primarily for those institutions that are doing paper and pencil evaluations. There's a high correlation between grades and attendance in class, and those students with lower grades may be attending class less often and may have missed the in-class assessment. How satisfied are students with the quality of their teaching? Generally speaking, students are, sort of positive. They're not at that high end. You can see 16% strongly agree, whereas 72% agree that they're satisfied with the quality of teaching. We see, again, a few differences here. Surprise, surprise, students with higher grades are more likely to be satisfied with the quality of teaching than those with lower grades. 22% of students with an A- or higher strongly agree that they're satisfied, and that drops down to just 10% of those with a C+ or lower. So what is students' commitment to completion? So, we're a little bit early in the process. They're just, give or take about halfway or 3/4 of the way through their first year. What are they thinking about? Well, so in terms of their perceptions of effort, 95% say they're willing to put in the effort that is required. 90% say they normally go to class, all their classes. 71% can deal with stress, and 65% say they have good study habits. Again, correlations with this question and grades. Students with lower grades are less likely to say, or less likely to agree, that they can deal with stress and they have good study habits. There's less differences around grades and willing to put in effort and going to class, but students with lower grades can identify the fact that they are having trouble dealing with stress, but also that they have good study habits. Their perceptions of their education, 83% say most of their courses are interesting. 82% say their course load is manageable. 76% say they're in the right program, and 76% say they had adequate information about their program before enrolling in it. So fairly high, although not above sort of that nice 80% mark that we'd like to shoot for. In terms of perceptions of finances, so these tend to be the ones that are on the lower end. Only 71% say that they have the financial resources to actually complete their program, and 68% say that the university degree is worth the cost. In terms of perceptions of persistence, 88% plan to come back to the university next year, and that drops down slightly to 83% who plan to complete their degree at the university. 10% plan to transfer to another university next year, and 9% plan to transfer to college next year. There is some overlap between those two questions. So some basically say, well, I'm planning to transfer somewhere, maybe university, maybe college. But there are students who say at the same time that they plan to come back, but also at the same time expect to transfer somewhere. And so it's not a big group of people. It's about 2 to 3% indicate both. So there is some slight overlap between those two, but not a huge amount there. So now we started looking at some of their overall evaluations of their experiences, and so how satisfied are they with their university experiences? So you can see that they're much more satisfied with their decision to attend this university than the concern shown for them as an individual. 26% are very satisfied with their decision to attend versus 8% with their concern shown for them as an individual. So this question is a new question that's been sort of altered. Before, there was a question asked on the survey that said, would you recommend your university, yes or no? And we weren't finding a lot of differences. It was basically 90% plus were saying, yes, I would recommend my university. And so it wasn't given a lot of variability in those responses to be able to do much additional analysis after the fact. And so what we've added in is a question called the Net Promoter Score question. The Net Promoter Score is a question that is really used to assess commitment to a brand or a company. And so it's asked on an 11-point scale that runs from 0 to 10. And so 0 being, I would not at all recommend, up to 10, which I would be extremely likely to recommend. And what it does is it breaks people down into 3 groups based on their answers. And so those who answer a 9 or a 10 on this 11-point scale are called promoters. Those who answer a 7 or an 8 are considered passive, and anyone who gives a rating of 6 or lower are called detractors. And you calculate your score by taking your promoters and subtracting your detractors from them. And so overall, universities across Canada get a Net Promoter Score of about 14%. So 33% promoters minus 19% detractors, which is good. 14%, most commonly you'll see companies around the 10 to 30% mark. You tend to see companies, the ceiling is typically around the 60 to 70% mark. And those tend to be your very, very popular brands. The ones I see most often is Costco. Somehow Costco is the epitome of brand allegiance. They're typically around that 70% mark for some reason. I guess no one's ever shopped at one on a weekend. We do find some differences in this Net Promoter Score by size of university. So the smallest universities, so those Group 1 universities, they have a Net Promoter Score of 22%. compared to group 2 and group 3, so those medium to large size universities, they have net promoter scores of 11 and 12%. And so the smaller universities are ones that students are going to be more likely to be talking and recommending. In terms of their goal development, so 74% at this point have chosen their major, so less than a full year into their program, they say they've chosen it. After they've done, so right now about 30% expect to apply to a professional program and 33% expect to apply to graduate school. Of interest, those two questions are also asked on the graduating student survey, and we actually don't find that much shift in those percentages. You know, it could be a shift in who's expecting to do that, but typically those are around the 30% mark. So, you know, what happens in first year, doesn't seem to be a lot of change by the time in terms of those proportions by the time students get to the end of their program. Also, we find that 33% have a specific career in mind and 20% say they know their career options well. The 33% that have a specific career in mind is of interest, given the fact that if we remember way back to the beginning of the presentation, one of the biggest drivers of choosing or attending university was for a specific job. And so students tell us they're coming to study for a specific career, yet only a third of students have a specific career in mind. So a little bit of differences there in terms of why they're coming and where they are at this point. So what steps have they taken for employment? For the most part, they have not taken many concrete steps for employment. You know, most of these are what you call soft steps, talking to your parents or friends about employment, which could just simply be, you know, at the dinner table saying, yeah, I would like to work. Only 44% have created a resume, which seems a bit low. And otherwise, some of these concrete steps are typically 25% or less. And overall, there's about 9% of students who say they've taken no steps, so they've selected none of these in terms of steps that they have taken for employment. Now looking at facilities and services, so we ask about the use and satisfaction with 26 different services, and typically amongst those who use the service, satisfaction is typically very high. It's 80% plus, usually around the 90% range, with two exceptions, which have been the historical two perceptions over 25 years, and that is students are least satisfied with food and parking, which really is what people are least satisfied with almost anything is food and parking, so no surprise. The interesting thing is, if you chart satisfaction with food services over the course of CUSC surveys, this has gone up considerably over time. If you go back about 15 or 20 years, satisfaction with food services was tracking typically below 50%, and we see it sort of inching up by a percentage or two every single year, likely because universities are putting more time and effort into their food services, knowing that it seems to be an important factor for students' on-campus experiences. The only difference we find amongst students here is that students who self-identify as a member of a minority are less likely to use parking than those who do not self-identify, and a lot of it has to do with the fact, remember, that public transportation was a main factor in their decision of choosing universities because they don't have a vehicle. So in terms of current employment, so our first year students, how are they employed? So just give or take about a third of students say they are employed. And there's another 30% who are currently seeking work. Amongst those who are employed during the school year, they work about 14 hours a week on average, which depending on the job, you know, could be anywhere from 2 to 3 shifts a week. And amongst them, students who are employed, 43% say that their job has a negative impact on their grades. And so you're talking somewhere around 14 to 15% of students say that, you know, the hours they work and the job they have has some impact on their grades. In terms of their finances, so the first year students do not go in as much depth about financing education because there's a much more focus upon those earlier questions on motivators. And so the middle and graduating students focus much more on debt-related questions. So the only questions we ask students is about credit cards. 57% say they have a credit card, and 87% say they pay off their credit card each and every month. And so if you take all students with the credit cards, the average Unpaid debt is around $196, about $200 a student on their credit card. But when you just consider the amount for those who are not paying off their credit card, that debt amount increases to over $1,000, so actually $1,047 on average. There's a lot of differences here by student's age. The older a first-year student is, the more likely they are to have a credit card, the less likely they are to be paying off their credit card debt each month, and the higher amount of unpaid debt they have. For example, those who are 18 and younger, amongst those with debt, they report an average debt of around $753 in their credit card. For those 22 and older, so this increases as students get older, it jumps up to over $1,800 they're carrying in credit card debt. So financial awards from their university, about 64% say they have received a financial award from their university. There is a difference here amongst those receiving a financial award and size of the university. Middle-sized universities, so those that tend to have undergraduate and graduate programs, 73% say they've received a financial award. That compares to 57% at the smallest universities and 56% at the largest institutions. Also not surprising, there's a difference here by grades. Those with higher grades are more likely to report that they received a financial award. Also, those who are older are less likely to say they've received a financial award. Amongst this 64% who say that they've received a financial award, 33% say they would not have been able to attend their university without that financial award. And so you're talking somewhere around 20% of students overall, give or take, would not have been able to attend without the financial award or awards that they received. So that wraps up the CUSC questions. I'm going to look now at the experiment that was conducted for the 2019 survey. So every year, in collaboration with the CUSC board, we devise an experiment to look at how various things can impact response rates, impact responses. So we've looked at a number of things over the years. We've looked at wording in emails. We've looked at types of incentives that have been used. We've looked at how randomization of questions can impact responses. And so this year, the experiment that was done was the testing of what's referred to as a dashboard style survey. So instead of walking through the survey in a linear fashion, starting at question 1 and ending at question 180, students get to sort of choose their own adventure. And what they get to do is, the survey is broken down into 9 components, and they get to choose how they want to answer the survey. So if they want to start with financing, they can start with financing. If they want to start with selecting their institution, they can do it in any order they want. And we wanted to see what impact giving students more control over their experiences would have on completion rates. Because what we had seen in past results is typically once students come to the first set of large questions, so a bank of questions that might have 10 to 15 options, that tends to be where we lose the most students who don't complete the survey. Once they get past that, they tend to complete. And so the experiment was to see if using this option might actually increase response rates. And so what did we find? Nope, the dashboard definitely did not help those. Those who had the dashboard option, only 65% of students who started the survey, so that is they clicked the link, got to the first question, only 65% who got the dashboard option completed the survey. That compares to 85% who had the linear option where they just simply start at question 1 and work their way through the survey. And so you can see that having that option significantly dropped the response rate. And not only that, for those who did not complete the survey, those who had the dashboard only answered about 51 questions until they stopped, compared to those who had the linear, they stopped after about 73 questions. So not only did the dashboard make people less likely to complete, those who stopped tended to stop much earlier. And so couple reasons why this may be. One factor may be is you've simply, by using a dashboard, if I flick back up a slide, you've simply now just instituted more clicks, right? I now have to click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 more times, right? So now I have to click more, and that's adding more for me to do. Mentally, it might be more fatiguing because now you have to actually think about what you're doing. The other reason too is when you're answering the question in a linear fashion, the survey is actually sort of laid out in a linear fashion. It follows sort of the same order in which we presented results. It starts logically with how you selected your institution, your orientation. And so in the linear fashion, you're sort of almost walking through a story of your first year. Whereas if you choose it in a dashboard style, you're sort of jumping all over the place, and maybe logically it doesn't sort of fit with how a student wants to do it. So although it had an impact on response rates, we also wanted to look at response rates by university. And so you can see here is the regular, and here is the dashboard. And you can see in almost all cases by the universities that participated, and there were a number of them, I think there were 26 in total, 28 in total, all of them but 2 had higher response rates with the regular dashboard. And so we were a little confused at why did these 2 universities have higher results or higher completion rates for the dashboard than the regular. And the reason is because these universities are quite small. One had only 5 students who were assigned to the dashboard option, and the other one had only 6. And so in one case, the one at the top, it was all 5, so 5 out of 5 students who were assigned the dashboard completed. And in the case down here, it was 5 out of 6. And so because it was such a small number of students, that really accounts for the difference. It's just the fact, just by happenstance, it was so small. So statistically, not different, but you can see the pattern is a much lower response rate, and very different at some universities, right? Very considerable 20% or higher drops. The other thing we looked at is we said, okay, it's clearly had an impact on completion rates. Did it have any impact on responses? And so we compared responses across the 2 surveys for those who completed the survey, and we found no difference in how students answered the survey. And so you might think that, especially towards the back end of the survey, you might see a difference because students who have done the linear fashion, you know, it's a longer survey, and so they might start to think less about their answers. They might start to fudge their answers a little bit, and we found no difference between the dashboard version, linear version, and how students answer the questions. Typically, the differences between those 2 versions were 2% or less when we're looking at various categories. And so that tells us at the end of the day, the recommendation going forward is to not use this dashboard because clearly it has a fairly significant impact on response rates. And so, you know, it would have been interesting to see had we not actually done this. And again, I think only 10%, for those who had opted into the experiment, only 10% of their sample was given the dashboard. You know, we might have seen that total response rate bump up by a percentage point from 34 to 35%, which, you know, doesn't seem like a lot, but, you know, it's anytime we can get extra responses is always good, which is why we like to do these experiments. So that wraps up the presentation. So I think we'll take a look and see if there are any questions.
You got compliments on your audio, so people like hearing your dulcet tones.
I in the mirror every day I practice this. Also, maybe it's people who have joined before and I wasn't wearing this super fancy headset because I wanted to copy Glenn's super fancy headset. So, so one of the questions sent asking is, the data is represented of member universities. Is that correct? Yes, and so in this survey, there are institutions that can opt to participate that are colleges or non-universities who can opt in to do the survey. They are not included in this presentation because there's only those universities and only member universities that are used for this analysis. And so if there were any colleges or other universities or other institutions that participated, you will have received your results. You would have got your data and your comparators, but that is correct that those institutions are not in the results we are showing here today. I've got a question about what brand is it. Hold on, I'm gonna look. I don't know what brand it is. I think I can tell. It is. Oh, I can look. It is a Sennheiser. The quality people at Sennheiser, Sennheiser, which sounds very German to me. So, any other? I don't see any other questions. So I'll just wait a few minutes in the chat to see if anyone else has any additional questions. Of course, if you can't think of any now, you can always contact myself or anyone at the CUSC board. I can do it. Oh, there is a question here. What % of the sample identified as transgendered or non-binary? So the gender question is not an asked question. It is supplied by institutions. And so each institution, depending on how they classify it, less than 1%. I think it ends up being something like 0.03%. In the institution's data files have a non-binary or a definition that is not male or female. So it's why if we saw it on one of those first slides, it adds up to 100% because those non-binary ones or those ones that are in other categories basically don't account for a full percentage. Another question here, are there any trend differences from previous iterations of the survey? So because there are some questions that have existed over the past 25 years. As I mentioned in the beginning, the surveys went through a big revamp in 2015, so it's only the second time that this iteration of the survey. I think the major trend issues that we have seen on questions that we can look at historically and say, okay, these have basically stayed the same, categories the same, questions the same. The big changes we've seen is a much higher percent of students self-identifying as visible minority. That has creeped up every single year. Now, of course, some of that is going to be influenced by who's participating from year to year. As I said, satisfaction with food services has gone way up over the past 20 years. Satisfaction with parking, even though it's low, has also crept up over time. We're also seeing more students self-identify as having some sort of disability or accessibility issue. But that question changed considerably in 2016, so long-term comparisons are somewhat difficult. But part of it may be how that question was asked. Part of it may be actually how students are thinking about accessibility as well. Any notable differences by region? There may be. We haven't analyzed by region of the country, so it's entirely possible. One thing to consider, if I was to analyze these results by region, is you probably would need to do some weighting to ensure that you are accounting for the size of the universities in it, because, for example, you may have overrepresentation of certain types of universities by some regions. So, for example, you may have overrepresentation of some of the larger institutions in the Atlantic provinces where there was almost virtually 100% of the universities participated this year. Whereas, say, if you were to look at the West, you may be missing a lot of large institutions, or you might have an overrepresentation of small. And so if that was to be looked at, I would look at the institutions that are participating to try to ensure you're doing some weighting to sort of balance the fact that are we missing ones that may have a big factor. Another question here. I noticed the question related to accommodations for learning who report disability. Is there a rationale for excluding accommodations? I don't know what the rationale is. Glenn, I don't remember what the decisions were around changing some of the questions around accessibility.
Yeah, okay. That would require me to remember that discussion. Well, I know there is some debate about names of categories and trying to align with other categories without making the categories seem pejorative, but I don't recall about the accommodations part of that discussion.
Mm-hmm. What are the questions around the dashboard? So when people were using the dashboards, if I flick back up here, where did students tend to start? They tended to start with, most students, when they did the dashboard, tended to go through it in a linear fashion. The only way we could actually tell that, so once a student completed, we weren't able to actually assess how they completed it. So what we did is we looked at the non-completers, and virtually 80% of the non-completers had gone section 1, section 2. And so it seems to indicate that most people, when they were doing it, were simply trying to go through it in a linear fashion anyways. Another comment, to understand our students better and to support EDI efforts, it would be helpful to have more of the data reflected in the slides. The mention of some of the motivations related to visible minority are something we need to look at more. Absolutely. We try to make the slides less busy and have some of the stuff just in the discussion. But of course, if anyone wants that information, It's contained in the CUSC master report, which is available on the CUSC website. And so if you download the master report, any differences I talked about by visible minorities or age or grade, all those things are identified in the master report and can be found there. Another question here, any head scratchers or outliers in this? To me, the big one is around, well, not a head scratcher so much as I'm surprised that attendance at orientation is, basically at 2/3 of students, given how much importance people place on that. That is something that we haven't seen grow over the years. So that's one where I know institutions put a lot of effort into those orientations. The fact we've seen almost no change in that, to me, is something where it's a bit of a concern. The other head scratcher, or the other interesting aspect to me, is around employment, and the fact that there's 30% of people who say they are currently seeking employment. And so my question always around that is what type of employment do those 30% who don't have employment, are they looking for? And that's always one, we do a lot of labor market work, and it's always one where those 30% who say they're looking for a job, often they're looking for a very specific job that they're not qualified or are very unlikely to be doing while they're in university. Whereas, how many of those are actually looking for what I'll call, a university job, right? Your standard, retail, restaurants, slightly above minimum wage jobs. And so that's one where it'd be interesting to see, to do research around that 30% who say they're seeking a job, because it seemed like a very high proportion that don't have a job and are looking for one. Like, what are they actually looking for? Are they looking for something that they're like, well, I'm waiting till I get that $25 an hour job, and if I don't get that, I'm not going to do anything. So I don't see any other questions, but as I said, there's always contact information for the CUSC board or myself, and we're always here to answer questions. And I hope people found this interesting. For those who participated in 2019, I hope you've had a chance to start looking at and analyzing your own and others' data, to start taking a look at what is happening. And as I'm being told that this session is being recorded and will be available. I think it goes on the YouTubes for the kids to look at, because if I was 18 years old, I would have wanted to sit through this presentation for sure. So it'll go on the same place that my kids watch videos of people lip syncing songs. So it seems like the appropriate place for it to go.
We will also send out a link to all the register for the meeting, and it's available through the CUSC website. Right. Any further questions? I just go back a little bit on the accommodations. We do ask about satisfaction with services for students with disabilities. So that gives you some of that, but it doesn't break it down unless you're looking at your own data. Mm-hmm. It doesn't break it down. You could theoretically, with your own data, use the particular disabilities and the satisfaction with overall services for students with disabilities to get at satisfaction by particular disability. If I recall the CUSC board discussion, it felt like we were asking the same question twice. Mm-hmm. And it's a long survey as it is, so trying to cut down on the number of questions. All right. Anything else that's coming up? I'm not seeing. I kind of wish this one would tell me when people are typing, but I don't see any further comments, questions. All right. Well, thank you all for participating today. Thanks, Nicholas, for going through this and preparing this presentation for us. Hopefully, we will see many of you at the SERPA meeting in October, and have a great day. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.